Hello, and welcome to A Reader's Paradise. I'm your host, Earl Sewell. This is a great place to hang out if you love hearing literature performed for you, as well as hearing author interviews. Hello, and welcome to A Reader's Paradise. I truly have something exciting for you this episode. Recently, a reader from the D.C., Virginia, Maryland area named Amy interviewed me about my book, Lenny Gray. And so on this podcast, you will hear that interview in its entirety. Also, a bit of more exciting news is that Lenny Gray is now being read in the following countries. It is being read in Jamaica, Barbados, South Africa, and St. Martin. That is truly exciting for me to see this book get some global readership. Well, anyway, without further ado, let's jump into the interview about Lenny Gray.
It's perfect. It's perfect.
How are you?
I am fine.
Thanks, Earl. Today I'm getting a chance to chat with one of my favorite authors, Earl Sewell. I have enjoyed reading several of your adult novels in the past and was thrilled to not only read your newest novel, historical fiction, Lenny Gray, but also to go on this listening journey with the first audiobook of Lenny Gray.
Yay!
So thank you for sharing that with me. It has been a pleasure just listening to Lenny Gray and reading Lenny Gray. So thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. I'm so glad you enjoyed the book, Lenny Gray. I'm so glad you liked the journey of it. And I know you have some questions, so please feel free to start asking your questions about the book.
Okay. Well, one of the things that I've enjoyed about your work in the past is your ability to weed such complex characters and then create this message of hope and healing. With your new novel, which happens to be historical fiction, which is a first for you,
Yes.
The characters, Lenny Gray and Curly, are just that. They're complex people trying to work within the societal limitations as well as their own self-imposed limitations. So, what did you go through as you were creating these two central protagonists of the novel, Lenny Gray?
Well, that's a great question, because one of the things that I did not want to do was write a book that was flat and that had characters that were, not interesting, that were just sort of predictable.
Right.
So with this book, Lenny Gray, I really wanted to write characters that people knew and could relate to, but they were very, very complex. In other words, the problems that they had to face, there was no easy solution to the complex situations that they were in. And as a result, since their situations didn't have easy resolutions, it made them even more complex, because I think even as a reader, when you look at if it was me and I was in this situation, what would I have done? And it was one of these things, if they did one thing, something else didn't work. And so I liked making them complex because it keeps readers engaged. It keeps readers wanting to know what happened next. And then the complexity of it, the society itself that they lived in was a character in itself that, also pressed against them, that influenced behavioral outcomes for these characters.
Yeah. I wonder what their ACE scores would have been, right?
Right. Yeah, they would have very, very, very high adverse childhood experiences. Yes, yes, they did. Especially given the time frame that the story is written in, between 1918 and 1951.
I'm sorry. What was the spark for you to write Lenny Gray? Actually, to even delve into historical fiction, because you have over 29 novels, if not more.
Yes.
You published young adult as well as adult novels. So what made you foray into the historical fiction?
Lenny Gray actually haunted me. It was a book and a story that haunted me. And for years, I ignored it. For years, I did not want to write this book. And it was one of these books that people said, oh, you should you should write this because the way the book came about is a bit of I did genealogical research on my father's side of the family.
Okay.
And so I was looking for stories and things from that side of the family because my family was always talking about, oh, you don't know this story or you don't know that story. And so when I started trying to gather as much information as I could, that was the platform I used to write the story. But be honest with you, I was haunted by it and I ignored it because I didn't want to write it because I didn't think I was going to be talented enough to write a book about a time period that I did not live in, because it takes place in 1918. It starts in 1918 and goes to 1951. And I just didn't think that since I didn't actually live in that time that I would not be talented enough to write it. But that wasn't the case. Apparently, that wasn't the case. Given some of the feedback that I've gotten on the book, yes.
All right. So with it being historical fiction, you tie a lot of, events from that time period, from the 1918s to the 1950s into the novel. How did you go about gathering all that information, like the flood, the flu? You tied all those different epidemics and events into the story. Where'd you get your research?
Yeah. With it, I wanted to, because that time period was in the American South, was a time of Jim Crow, and then a time of natural disasters like the Spanish flu. So one of the things that I was doing when I decided to shape the work, I wanted history. I wanted these people to march forward through particular times in history, and I wanted to show how that history impacted them and impacted how they lived and impacted how they interacted with the world. So not only do I start the story with the Spanish flu outbreak of 1918, but other natural disasters like the stock market crash was big to American society at that time. The fight between Joe Louis and Max Schmeling right prior to the Second World War was a huge thing for not only Americans, but, in particularly African Americans. And so I wanted to show where these characters were during that time. And also, it helped me to keep a timeline of marching forward in history.
Right.
So I name each chapter the year that we're in so that the readers constantly know, okay, we're in 1918, we're in 1919, those sorts of things.
So with that being said, the plight of Lenny and Curly, and they went through a lot.
Yes.
Explain like the different historical events and how that had a major impact on them individually or as well as a couple, raising their multiple number of children they ended up having. How did this all have an impact on them and moving forward in their own lives?
Yeah, so the time period that it takes place in the American South is at the height of the Jim Crow era, which is like the second coming of slavery, because the Jim Crow era, pushed African Americans as close to chattel slavery as it could. In other words, people could not find jobs. They could not go into public places like libraries. There was this keeping away of information and knowledge from this group to keep them as limited in information and knowledge as possible. So how did this, impact them? The way they showed up in the world, they could only show up one way, and that was pretty much powerless. And showing up powerless leads to all kinds of issues, because when you show up powerless, you don't have the ability to generate resources.
Yeah.
If you're illiterate, you don't have access to personal development and growth. If you're in a rural area and you're illiterate and you don't have money, you become very superstitious. Yeah. And the superstition also aids to the mental illness that is going to be generated over this. So it was like the way society shaped them was intentional, because it was designed for them to not do well. It was designed so that they could be controlled. It was designed so that they could live in fear. And if you're living in fear, you're most likely going to live on your knees. And if you live on your knees, anybody can come along and say anything to you and do anything that they want to you. So I made it so that, again, not only were the main characters very important, but society, the social system, the social constructs were equally as important.
And that just brings up the image of Mr. Bettis.
Mr.
Mr.
Bettis.
Had a
Yes.
central role in kind of keeping Curly on his knees, keeping him.
Yeah, and so sometimes you have people who come into your life that are powerful influencers. That they especially if you're not sure of who you are, and you don't know when you don't know who you are, people will come along and slap labels on you and say you're this and you're that. And
Right.
if you end up believing that, and you give this person all of your personal power, well then there you have it. And that's what Mr. Bettis was for Curly. I mean, Curly gave up all of his personal power to Mr. Bettis.
Yes, and Lenny was looking at him like, "You gonna let him take your power?"
Well, yeah, and of course, Lenny didn't understand that. She didn't understand how he could do this. But then but then again, and then what ends up happening is you get the characters got overloaded with emotions. These
Yes.
bad emotions. Their bodies got flooded with stress hormones, and then they found themselves not only living on their knees but living in stress on their knees.
I agree. Well, you alluded to superstition, and that definitely was completely woven through the novel. So, talk to me a little bit more about why you chose to use superstition and a lot of symbolism in Lenny Gray.
Well, writing from the African American's perspective in the South during that time, you had superstition was just going to run all through everything, and superstition was
Right.
a way in some parts to explain what they could not explain, to explain knowledge that they did not have. So people came up with superstitious beliefs. Some of them were good, and some of them were not so good. For examples, people had a superstition like if you brush your hair and you get the hair in the comb, oh, you better burn that hair because if somebody gets a hold of your hair, they could kill you.
Right.
Or the superstition, step on a crack, break your mama's back. There are all sorts of superstitions. So the way I use superstition in the book was a way to show the reader that these characters were not only complex, but they were lost to a certain degree. And they believed in their superstition so much that they believed they began to live by their superstition. And so even when I explore superstition, when you look at what superstition is, even if we look at the Bible, and take it at its face for certain things, there's a certain amount of superstition in that. When you look at Moses, where Moses parts the Red Sea, and then the people, walked, across. I was like, well, wouldn't there be mud? How did the wagon wheels get through? Wouldn't there be rocks and all uneven earth and all of that under there? But we don't. We take it as that Moses parted the Red Sea and the children walked away. They crossed through with no problem. There wasn't a bridge there. They didn't say there was a bridge where they walked across and it was free. No. And it's so. But we believe in that story. And so for these characters, I created stories, superstitious stories for them to believe in that weren't necessarily, from the Bible, but from their own concoction, from their own brains.
All right. So one of the other things that I really enjoyed was the fact that you created over 31 different voices for the characters. You really did bring them to life. I mean, they did rise from the pages for sure. What was that like for you, being your first audiobook?
Oh, okay. So with Lenny Gray being my first, I know this is a loaded question. With Lenny Gray being my first audiobook, this was another area where I had to really step out and trust myself because I didn't think I could do it. But
Right.
even though I was afraid to do it, I did it anyway. And so it's one thing to hear a character inside of your mind and write what they say on a page. It's that's you hear the voices inside of your mind as a writer, and then you write what they say.
Right.
There's no vulnerability there. But when you vocalize those voices and you really become them, that's something completely different. And as I began to narrate the book, and listen back to how I sound, it was like a channeling. I felt like I was that it wasn't me. I felt like that I was a conduit to channel
Right.
these voices, because it was just like, it was like, whoa, you know, even I was like, whoa, that's me, you know, and then also to not only vocalize those voices, but vocalize those voices in the emotions that the characters were feeling at the time. You know, to stay in voice and show anger in that voice, to show sadness or hurt in that voice, and to do 39 different voices. And let me tell you, I didn't use tricks or magics. It was just me and my vocal range to do that.
Microphone.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so one of my favorite characters in Lenny Gray was John, the one-armed gravedigger.
John the Gravedigger.
So whose voice you nailed. Oh my gosh. So anyone, if you have not had a chance to go out and download the Audible for Lenny Gray, or even get the ebook, it's a must read for sure. Which character was your favorite to perform?
All of them.
Well, like I said, was it 39?
Yes,
39
yeah.
Okay.
There were, John. I liked all of my characters for different reasons. I liked John, the one-armed braver, for what he represented and how I intermingled him into the storyline. I love performing Curly because Curly was just such a difficult man who was complex, but I think the readers understood how he got to be the way that the way that he was, and it was just something where he just couldn't help it. That was just the way he was. And Lenny, he was stuck. And for Lenny, it was like Lenny got lost. She got lost in her circumstances, because in 1918, Black women, did not have a whole lot of say. They did not have a lot of power. They didn't have a lot of resources. And so they had to get along the best that they could, even if they were in a situation where they weren't treated the best.
Right. Whose dream was deferred. I mean, when she was running and along the train tracks, I was like hoping for her to get away. But I knew that she could, but I so wanted her to.
Yeah, it was, you wanted that. And so that's what, I think that's what makes it be like, your heart goes out to her and you feel it. It's like, oh my God, Lenny, just keep going. But you knew that she was going to get caught. And it sort of reminds me of the movie Black Panther, when the Black Panther, has to kill Killmonger. Right. And you understood Killmonger. You understood Killmonger's motivation. It's like, he was a villain that was right, but you knew that he could not make it for the sake of story. Yeah. And so that's the same thing with Lenny Gray and Curly. You knew that this man was going to provide her with a difficult life, but you knew there was no escaping him. Yeah. And so that led to unavoidable suffering. It led to it led to
Frankel reference, unavoidable
suffering. Yes, it led to a lot of suffering, and then even today, people are suffering. People live through suffering, but even with all the advances we've had and all the great things we're able, the resources and knowledge that we have, we still have suffering going on.
Yeah, I mean, you can't escape it. You got to figure out how to work through them.
Yeah, you got to.
Because I'm an avid reader, and obviously, we've discussed lots of novels together. What's next for you?
Oh, there's a lot of things in the fire that are what's next for me. I have a young adult book that I need to write. I have another work of historical fiction that I need to write. I have. Actually, I have two works of historical fiction I need to write. I want to do one on my mom's side of the family, similar to Lenny Gray. So I've been flirting with the idea of turning Lenny Gray into a stage play. So there is a lot of work that I have ahead of me.
Fantastic. I appreciate you taking time to talk to me.
Well, thank you for taking the time to do the interview. And for those of you who don't know, please go out and download a copy of Lenny Gray. It's available on iTunes, it's available on audible.com, and it's available on amazon.com. The book comes in two formats. It comes in as an ebook or it comes in as an audiobook. I highly recommend the audiobook because it's great.
Yeah. I mean, either way, you're going to experience something that you've never had before.
Yeah.
But the audiobook is going to take you to another level for sure.
That concludes the interview. If you'd like a copy of the novel Lenny Gray, all you have to do is hop on over to Amazon.com, where you can order the book as a Kindle ebook or as an audiobook that is downloadable. Well, folks, once again, thank you for taking the time to listen. Until next time, happy reading.